Joker is a study on tragedy. A professor of mine once wrote how tragedy and comedy are two sides of the same coin. It is the context that helps gives us clues to determine what we are allowed to perceive and feel. So tragedy, to a large extent, is a kind of perception. It is partly subjective and changes with the eye of the beholder. A film like Joker helps to take a closer look at this thin line. The 2019 iteration of the Joker character is going to be discussed for a long time. Not because all critics loved it, but because the audience has. The concept of Joker has always been a formidable character to portray, and this year we receive an entire story dedicated to better understanding why that is. Previous films showed him in how he relates to the hero Batman, but Todd Phillips and Scott Silver wrote Joker to better understand how we can see him on his own terms, not as an accessory to the protagonist, but as a person complete on his own. In this film, we see him not as a pseudonym, but as a human. He has a name, Arthur Fleck. That in itself is a big statement. What happens when you remove the shield of a title, a persona? Bruce or Batman? Clark or Superman? Eric or Magneto? The vulnerability that comes from humanity is removed. Or do you just become extra human, more receptive and reactive to everything around you? There's a kind of sense of freedom to become a different person, to tiptoe to the deep end of your personality. This film shows that Arthur and Bruce are both victims, people fallen from the different platforms that each one stood on, scarred by external forces, and yet both can find some commonality in their victimhood and their need to influence others for it. Batman is what happens when the superego takes control. Very virtuous, always good, super perfect. And Joker is the product of when the it takes control. Carnal, self-serving, doesn't care about anyone else. The people of Gotham, like most people, tend to fall in between those extreme sides. Most of us tend to listen to the balanced voice of the ego. Calm, measuring both those voices, and tending to take the middle road. And here is the terrifying part. Everyone has the potential to understand both of these masked, non-human personas, to understand the voices of these extreme performers speaking from their pulpits. Both Bruce and Arthur are victims and heroes to different crowds at different times. Joker is the angel of mayhem, and he can garner an audience as big as Batman. No other nemesis of Batman can have that same effect on the public. The same people that love Batman can easily vilify him if their perception of him changes. And the same is actually with Joker. The scary part about watching this film is that the audience can actually sort of understand where Joker is coming from, and also be aghast at all the shocking things he does. Once you begin to understand something, it is harder to lump it into one big adjective. Villain, hero, bad, good. It is pretty obvious it's not right to do any of the things Joker does, but how many times can you sit in a film and begin to even understand the glimpse of the person behind the mask and makeup? The film is trying to convey how perception of good and bad is subjective and fluid. In the film, Arthur's character hears and sees all, but he feels nobody ever hears him. He has a condition that makes him laugh hysterically, especially at moments when he is anxious. There is pain and embarrassment in that laugh. It leads him to get into all sorts of troubles in society because the laugh is perceived as insensitive or a challenge. The film examines the dance of society and interpretation often. How does reaction change to the same event if it happens to someone rich or poor? The difference between laughing at someone and with someone. Where do we draw the line? How do we draw the line? As I was thinking of these things while watching the movie, it kind of played out right in the theater. In about a 70% packed screening of this film, there were few people in the audience who were laughing at scenes that most others were not, and at one point some guys laughed at a climactic scene when everyone in the hall was holding their breath that absolutely no one else laughed. The same event is interpreted in such different ways. Look at historical events, current news, leaders, policies. People will often have stark diverging opinions on the same thing. The fact that a comic book movie can raise so many questions is a feat in its own. Joker and Batman are both performers playing their role to their crowds. Both take the law in their own hands, but for very different reasons. They need a persona to carry their intentions out, always tiptoeing on the thin line of hero and villain, being loved and hated.